G'day cunts. Thought I'd have a bit of a laugh about this one that came across my feed a few days ago. It's a press release from Malcolm Roberts, who is of course a One Nation Senator for Queensland, but who is also a man whose vacant eyes reveal not only his lack of intelligence, but also a soul. The press release is titled Ban Antifa Terrorism, so you know it's going to be great right away. Considering too, though, that this comes from a man so far removed from reality that even when a world-renowned scientist held the evidence for climate change in front of his face, he still denied it, well, we're getting into some real tenfold territory then, aren't we? So let's get gandering. It's short and packed full of batshit crazy goodness, so let's go through it all. It begins. Senator Malcolm Roberts calls on the Prime Minister to demonstrate the same political leadership as President Trump. Yes. Please, Scotty, emulate the leadership of the guy who hid in his bunker because of a peaceful protest before gassing those protesters so he could walk in a park, causing Yankees to become more unified than we've seen them in years, but against him. What a start to hitch your wagon to. The sentence continues, and declare Antifa a terrorist organisation. Now look, it's boring as fuck to repeat this now, but of course it needs to be said. Even if we wanted to, there's no Antifa organisation to declare terrorist or to ban. Antifa is just shorthand for anti-fascism. Anti-fascism is a political ideology, which just means you're against fascism. There are organisations and people which are anti-fascist, most if not all of which I can believe Malcolm doesn't like because they counter his politics to varying degrees. Thing is though, to level his vampiric stare at them in any meaningful way, he'd need to identify specific groups or individuals that are breaking the law and doing so in a manner that constitutes terrorism. Now I doubt he could do that, primarily because I don't think such a group exists, but of course we all know he's too lazy anyway. Such a thing would require actual investigation and work, and Malcolm prefers to restrict his research to sources like Answers in Genesis. Next line. We need to stop these far-left anarchists who use violence and fear to push their radical socialist agenda before they recruit and organise further in Australia, Senator Roberts said. Okay, continuing. Australia is a peaceful democratic nation where people resolve their differences through mutual respect and debate, culminating at the ballot box. Really though? It wasn't that long ago that Malcolm's party leader advocated using cattle prods on Extinction Rebellion protesters. You know, that movement chock full of ageing liberal peace hippies whose preferred form of protest is lying down. Just one relevant example among many, of course, but yeah, that line is about as rich as Jeff Bezos. I'm also noting that his response to apparent recruitment is to try and make a political philosophy illegal and have it declared terrorist. So much then for the free speech defending right. Next bit. Antifa are already attacking police and intimidating innocent people attending public events in Australia. I'm tempted to just say citation needed there. Woe that we don't live in a world where that is enough, because despite this sentence being as vague as my sexuality when I'm watching The Witcher, it is, of course, something that would resonate with some of the more gullible folks out there. My necessary response to this then is to cite the fact that attempts to prove the existence of some dangerous rampaging band of leftists always falls fucking short of the mark. Peter Dutton, soulless immigration minister and Nosferatu come amongst us, is rare in that he is a right-winger who has tried to get specific on who and what he considers left-wing terrorism operating in Australia. He probably didn't want to do that, but was pushed to after his own spy agency specifically warned of the threat of right-wing terrorism in some report or something or other. And Dutton of course can't have that. The politics of far-right Australia matches his own far too closely, and so he responded by referring to a need to deal with left-wing terrorism as well. When pushed for clarification on who he was talking about, Dutton told us that he was referring to radical Islamists, which just no, before a member of his staff gave us the example of those hippies gluing themselves to roads from before. How fucking scary does this lot look? So what I'm saying here is, Malcolm doesn't get specific on this point because he can't. Onwards. Senator Roberts added, all responsible politicians should be defenders of our cultural, social and democratic values, and it is the Prime Minister's job to act urgently and decisively to protect the social fabric of our peaceful society. Australia's political leaders need to swiftly and ruthlessly safeguard Australia from this same fate. I mean, what a load of sanctimonious waffle, but given that he can't establish his case here, one has to assume that what he really wants is to see people he doesn't like being unable to protest. And yeah, it's pretty dishonest to pretend to be so in favour of our liberal democracy when that's the aim or outcome. A dishonest politician. Strike me pink. It goes on. Antifa protesters are self-proclaimed anti-capitalists, oppose freedom and democracy, and are destroying major cities in the USA. Now, of course, we should all know by now that the FBI wasn't able to turn up evidence of specific anti-fascist involvement in the US protests. This is just Malcolm getting excited and premature, which I'm sure is embarrassing for him. But hey, let's say you could call these protests anti-fascist. BLM is working against fascism, even if it's not language that they would use, nor their explicit intention. In that case, though, sweet. Cities aren't being destroyed, Malcolm. You're just being hysterical. To wit, the protests have received overwhelming support even in Seppo land, so I doubt this is going to get the traction that you're hoping for. It goes on. Modelling themselves on previous Antifa movements going back as far as the 1930s, their agenda has always been aligned with communist political parties aimed at bringing about the downfall of capitalism. Well, I seem to remember from history there being a fairly famous and essential alliance with communists against fascism. Apparent elements of fascism in the regimes of all three of these men notwithstanding. But aside from that obvious point, what can I say but yeah? Look, not every anti-fascist is against capitalism by default, but many, if not nearly all of us over here, believe that capitalism, especially the unregulated kind, leads inexorably to fascism, and so capitalism is also opposed. But the thing is that this is actually true. Concentrations of power lead to authoritarianism, capitalism lets you accumulate wealth, which leads to power, which leads to fascism. So again, yeah. The really important thing to note here, though, is the context of the 1930s. Like, what are you saying, Malcolm? Are you glad that anti-fascists in the 1930s in Germany failed in their struggle against the rise of fascism? Do you denounce them as well as modern iterations of the movement? You know, there was a guy who got around back then who vehemently opposed communism and anti-fascism. Perhaps you've heard of him. I mean, you might have thought that Malcolm, being a guy whose Senate seat was kept warm by the guy who referenced a final solution on immigration in the Senate, would know to speak more carefully. And, well, you'd be wrong. Last sentence. The irony of this movement is that Antifa, formed from the term anti-fascist, are themselves behaving as fascists to suppress opposition and call for strict obedience to their self-determined culture of control over others. Okay, boomer. For one, this is of course frog shit. What Malcolm means when he says strict obedience to self-determined control over others is that there's people out there who tell him not to pick on vulnerable people by doing things like, for example, demonising trans children. And in this specific case, this strict obedience literally means people aren't happy with police murdering and locking up people for being black, and they want this to stop. Like, you could just not be a knob, Malcolm. But the irony in his statement about irony is just so magical. In Malcolm's world, protesting police murder is the behaviour of fascists. Is Orange Daddy gassing those very same protesters though, despite these protests being the cornerstone of the sort of society Malcolm claims to be oh so attached to, is in fact protecting us all from fascism. It's just so fucking bizarre. To finish up then, this, as with so much of what Malcolm does, probably isn't going anywhere. There is no Antifa to ban, and I think that even Scummo would understand that to attempt such a move would be a huge misstep and a waste of time. This kind of press release is therefore little more than virtue signalling. Of course, it will probably have the effect of appealing to the voters that have kept him and his party around, but those nuffies were set on voting for him anyway, so whatever. Mostly I'm just glad I've got something to laugh at. Anyway, that'll do. Stay safe. See yous.